This is episode 169 of the Terms of Reference podcast.
The idea is to enable groups to achieve results that they did not think were possible in a very short period of time. We call them 100-day challenges. The way this works is really to create a space in which these representatives of the various stakeholders are able to innovate in new ways, to execute with more discipline, and to collaborate at much more intensive levels in a bubble, if you will, that takes them out of the usual things that stand in the way of high performance.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. How often do you consider what stands between you or your organization and operating at the highest levels of performance? It's a constant struggle that most of us, including yours truly, regularly fail at. We misallocate resources, we allow our time to be usurped by meaningless meetings, we scatter our attention across tasks that have nothing to do with our mission. The list goes on and on. I'm often surprised in what I like to call moments of inevitability. Another way to think about this is those times when you actually have to put up or shut up. I'm talking about those moments when if you don't deliver or find a solution or come up with a satisfactory answer, you lose the contest or someone gets hurt or you go out of business. Amazingly, so often in these times, tasks that were previously impossible get done. Creativity abounds and teams function with an efficiency that's a thing of beauty. My guest for the 169th Terms of Reference podcast, Nadim Matta, understands the power of these moments. In fact, his organization, the Rapid Results Institute, purposefully uses what they call 100-day sprints to create something of a pressure cooker environment to help social sector teams achieve meaningful results. I spoke with Nadim in Connecticut. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Nadim. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hello, Stephen. Great to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
So where do we find you sitting today? You are truly, I'm just going to pause with my usual intro question and say, you and I have been trying to set up this call for at least 4 months, maybe 5 months now. We've tried to do it once, but every time I talk to you, you're in a different part of the world. So where are you today?
I'm home, actually, just outside of New Haven. I am looking out of a window that looks over a beautiful salt marsh that kind of connects into Long Island Sound.
So yeah, and we're at the very last day of July here in 2017. So gorgeous weather, gorgeous setting. So time for a perfect conversation.
Yeah.
Nadim, you are the president of an organization called the Rapid Results Institute. As we usually do on the show, rather than me stumbling over trying to talk about it, why don't you describe what Rapid Results does?
Cool. Happy to do that. So Rapid Results work is really about taking or helping communities and organizations, typically involving multiple representatives from multiple organizations, try and put their heads around moving the needle on an important indicator that matters to them. So one example of that we applied not in development but here in the US is homelessness, and particularly veteran homelessness and more recently youth homelessness. And the idea is to enable groups to achieve results that they did not think were possible in a very short period of time. Typically, we organize these efforts in 100 days, and we call them 100-day challenges. And the way this works is really to create a space in which these representatives of the various stakeholders, are able to innovate in new ways, to execute with more discipline, and to collaborate at much more intensive levels, within 100 days in a bubble, if you will, that takes them out of the usual things that stand in the way of high performance. And what we find is more often than not, magic begins to happen.
So is 100 days an arbitrary number? Is it just, it's easy to digest, hey, 100 days is something that everybody can wrap their head around? I mean, it's just over 3 months. Or is there a magic there that you've discovered it takes 100 days for innovation to happen?
There is no, it's not a magic number per se. I think it seems like a good balance between having a time frame that really bites, where people feel like they need to do something the next day after they commit to it, rather than, spend the first couple of months planning to do something. And at the same time, enough of a time frame to have people work on things that are important, so they're not just sort of, picking the low-hanging fruit or picking things that don't require a few iterations before they can get to the results that you're looking for. And again, I know that the development is sort of the main focus of your work and our work, but because I just came last week from launching these 100-day teams here in the US in 5 cities in youth homelessness. So the topic we're talking about is, helping young people who are actually experiencing homelessness move from the street into stable housing that they can sustain for, hopefully for the rest of their life, and moving a significant number in each city out of the street into stable housing. And you can imagine saying we're going to do this in 3 weeks may be too overwhelming, but in 100 days, a lot can happen. And that's what we found. But it's not like sometimes they say 100 days and they extend to 120, and that's not the end of the world.
Maybe it would be really neat to juxtapose what you think you might see come out of the homelessness project to something that you have done in the past. And could you give us an example of some of the aha moments that you see, or something fantastical, or maybe something that didn't happen?
Yeah, just to be clear on the youth homelessness work, we have been at this for a little bit, for a few months anyway. And so we've had a number of communities already set their 100-day goals and go after
great. Perfect.
Actually achieve them. This is just happens to be an extension. It's becoming a bit of a national campaign, which is the way we like our work to unfold, so that it's not a one-off piece of work, but it becomes part of building momentum towards solving a problem at scale and at pace. And this is one of them that we're excited to be part of here in the US. So some of the things that communities in, previous work have done on youth homelessness, instead of each agency dealing or trying to be helpful to youth, managing its own lists of people that come to them for services, and essentially treating kind of whoever shows up on a first come, first serve basis, having the community aggregate all of the assets they have, whether they are subsidies for housing, whether they are services for young people who need these services as they get housed, and determining collectively what is the best fit of the existing assets in the community, regardless of where they are in which organization. What's the best match and fit to the individual that needs the support, regardless of which door they knock on or which person finds them on the street and becomes the first point of outreach. So without even adding extra resources, you find that there is a way to leverage existing resources much more effectively and to multiply these resources, because the people that are supported in this way may need less support as they move forward. So you can recycle the resources. There's a flow in the system for the various services that are provided to those who need them. So having one list, having a common way to prioritize, who's most in need of support, a common way to match people that need the support to the existing resources, is all part of what typically happens. And all of that requires trust and collaboration and relationship between organizations that typically are competing for the same dollar. So they're not really predisposed to do that. But somehow, by the impetus of trying to do something together that they collectively committed to, they put that aside, at least for the 100 days and often much beyond that.
How does your institute come into this equation? We can stay on the homeless example, or you can use a different one maybe, but I'm just wondering, do they seek you out? Are you getting phone calls and say, hey, we need you, or are you putting in proposals? And then, once you've sort of been selected to be a part of this, take us through your process. Like, how do you walk into an organization?
Yeah, no, happy to do that. And let me stick with homelessness, but if it's getting to be too much, you can nudge me and I can move to other contexts that, again, some of the work that we've recently, for example, been doing, and we've done in the past in sub-Saharan Africa, which has been very extensive as well. But again, just because it's fresh in my mind coming out of this very recently, in the homelessness work, we are at a space or at a place now where, yes, we do wait for cities really, or organizations in various communities. They are reaching out and saying, we've seen how these initial cities we worked with, actually Austin, Cleveland, and LA, we've seen what they've been able to do. We're really excited about it. We're hearing about these things in the conferences that they go to. We'd like to work with you on it. We are trying to aggregate communities. So, for example, one of the things that happened is, so we don't have the capacity to respond on a retail level to folks who come to us and want support. So one of the things that we did is we created, with the support of HUD here in the US, the Housing and Urban Development Department. They actually also came to us and said, we would like you to work with 5 communities at a time to do this work, the 100-day challenges. And we put out essentially applications to communities to apply if they want to participate in this process that is being supported or funded by HUD. And we opened this up for 2 weeks, and 30 communities applied, filled the applications. We screened them along with fellows from HUD and other parts of the homelessness support mechanisms in the country, and we selected the first 5 that we launched last week. So in that particular case, it was a combination of people coming to us, but also us opening, or HUD opening on our behalf, the application process for people to work with us on the 100-day challenges. So we've got 5 communities we launched last week, and there's another 5 rural communities we're going to launch later this summer. More generally, it's been folks who know of our work, sometimes directly a government. More often, for example, recently, some of the people who have heard about our work at the World Bank asked us if we can support an effort in Nigeria for a social protection program that is, that the government is using to distribute cash, essentially cash donations to individuals or families that are the poorest of the poor, if you will, and they needed to set up a system to do that in a responsible way, and that in a way that also links communities and states into some actions they need to take in order to become eligible for reimbursement of these cash disbursements. So they came to us to see if we can help kind of get that system up and running quickly within 100 days. Some other cases that come to mind, the government in the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, had a number of individuals in the country doing rapid results work that had been trained by Malagasy coaches that I had trained maybe 10 years ago, and supporting the government with doing 100-day challenges. And the government actually directly reached out to us, or the unit in government responsible for capacity building in government reached out and said, listen, these guys are doing good work, but we'd love to see them move to the next level in terms of really understanding more fully the essence of this work. And we'd like them to get certified. And they had support from the World Bank to do that, but the ask came directly from the government. And so we created a program to work with these coaches to help them take the work to the next level, if you will. So we've not had to go out and look for work, but every time somebody reaches out, somewhere or another, you have to write a proposal. Right?
Sure, of course. I guess the diversity of what you just described across those 3 programs, I'm trying to get the essence of exactly how you set up a 100-day challenge. Is it totally unique every single time? Is there a process that you go through that's from ABC? Or let's just say that, I'm the city of Denver and I've hired you to come and work with us. What's kind of the step-by-step you're going to take us through?
Sure. To answer your question, and I'd go to the specifics, there are some principles that we have found to be important in this work that enable both intense collaboration, rapid experimentation and innovation, and disciplined execution. These principles are built into the container, the choreography, the journey, the tracks that we set. Now, the tracks are going to be customized to some degree in each situation. But the one way to think, one analogy is that each community then builds the train and drives the train on these tracks. So the content of what goes into the actual work in the 100 days is entirely driven and shaped by the communities or the organization or the team and the leaders that are involved in this effort. So the way we typically would do this is, if Denver came to us, the first thing we'd say to the folks in Denver, are there a few other communities? And let me give you a specific example. So Seattle came to us and said, can we do 100-day challenges on youth homelessness? And when I say Seattle, it was actually some funders in the Seattle area that were keen to take the work on youth homelessness in Seattle and move it forward. And the first thing we suggested to them is to assemble a couple of other communities in the neighborhood, so to speak, so that there is a cohort of teams or communities that are going through the same journey together. Because one of the principles actually, or one of the levers, is this sense of learning, peer learning, as well as competition and collaboration across different communities. So we try to do this, so that there is multiple groups going through a similar journey at the same time. So that's step number one. Step number two is once they've assembled or got two other communities interested, we do some work with the leadership in the community that touches this issue to decide how they're going to narrow the focus in the first 100 days. So, for example, in the Seattle area, the question was, should we focus on prevention, which of course is important, or should we focus on young people who are actually on the street, which may, have a more urgency to it? Should we focus on sustaining their state of being housed once they're housed? And should we specifically focus on subpopulations, age groups 18 to 24, less than 18, African American? There's different ways to slice the pie. And the question is, given your context, given what's needed, where do you think would be the most productive place to start? So in their case, they focused in particular on a list of individuals that were actually experiencing homelessness, as in not in a shelter, but actually on the streets. And they wanted a special focus also, if I can remember correctly, on communities that are marginalized, including African Americans and the LGBTQ community, so that there's a special focus, some percentage of those that are served, it comes from these population groups. So that's the first conversation, is with the leaders on where to focus. And part of that conversation, given where the focus is, who should be on these teams? And that becomes a question of, these are not blue ribbon committees that we're forming. We insist that the 100-day teams are actually connected to service delivery. So they're closer to where the work is happening. Sometimes they're, in this case, caseworkers, etc. So they're more like frontline, between parentheses, folks, rather than people at the head of the top of the food chain in organizations. But they need to be authorized by the leaders to essentially say, it's up to you to decide from this sandbox we created what goal you want to set, what plan you want to develop, and how you're going to go about doing it. And we promise to have your back during the 100 days so that you can try new things, you might fail, etc. We're there to help you, but it's going to be completely up to you to decide how you're going to go about doing this. So that's the first step. The second step, after, freeing up these people through their leaders or supporting these leaders to free up these individuals, we pull these teams, and typically they'd be anything anywhere from 8 to sometimes 20 people on a team. In some systems, it's very hard. As much as we like to have smaller teams because it's more efficient, etc., often the level of trust is such that everybody feels they need to be represented on the team. Otherwise, they're going to kind of
they're not going to be represented properly. Yeah.
Right. So it kind of depends the size. But in any case, we pull them together for 2 days, sometimes 1 day, sometimes 2 days and a half, from different communities. In this case, it was Spokane, Pierce County, and Seattle King County, and work with these teams, the frontline teams, for these 2 days. So they do 3 things. One, they set their 100-day goal around that is a sort of a numeric target within the sandbox that was defined by the leaders. Second, they develop a plan that typically, by the way, these 100-day goals, we nudge them to set goals that are quite unreasonable in terms of the normal.
So more than a stretch goal?
Absolutely more than a stretch goal. So a goal that if somebody hears it, the first thing they're going to say is, are you serious or are you kidding? And the idea is not that, you're going to fail if you don't achieve that goal. It's just that if you really commit to it, you're going to have to try a whole bunch of new things in order to get there, because it's unlikely you're going to get there by just doing the same things a little bit faster. And so that becomes part of the design. And we have ways in which we help create the right frame of mind, so people who may have not really known each other that well or worked with each other on a team, these are from different organizations, get really excited about setting these goals that feel unreasonable, but at the same time, they end up believing them, which is kind of the equation we're looking for. And then come up with experiments and plans to get there, and then deciding also at the same time, the third thing, how they're going to work together during the 100 days so that they almost create their own governance structure. Because they're not part of one organization. There's no hierarchy in the system. And so they need to decide how they're going to work together, including actually electing right there and then a team leader or co-team leaders. And at the same time, we would have the leaders prior to that elect 2 or 3 representatives from the leadership group to be the sort of the focal points for support and mentoring to the teams. So we create essentially a new organizational mechanism for getting things done, even if it is sort of initially lives for 100 days with different ground rules, with a different social contract between the people on the team, the leaders, the people on the team, and their team leader. Completely, we put aside all the stuff that you typically find in most organizational structures that often makes it difficult for people to feel excited and empowered to go out and do things. And I think that's partly why these teams experience both the actual achievement, which again, it doesn't have to be precisely the unreasonable goal that is achieved, although more often than not it is. It's really the experience at the same time of seeing what's possible if they begin to operate in a different way and collaborate in a different way, and if they truly are empowered by the leaders to do what it takes, as opposed to go back to the leaders every other day with questions and permissions. Mm-hmm. They can and cannot do. So in some way, actually, I think the more exciting part for us about seeing these communities and teams operate is the fact that actually people who normally do not have a voice acquire a voice in the process. And it's a way to equalize power in a system, in fact, that we think actually helps generate the results that we've seen over and over again.
It seems to me that one of the biggest hurdles to the work that you do is the care and feeding, the construction of, and the guiding of these multi-sector, multi-partner teams. What are the biggest barriers that you find there? I mean, you've mentioned trust. Is it also just different agendas about trying to find these goals? Is it getting to that, overly audacious goal? Or do you find when people are sort of taken out of their workplaces and take off their brand, take off their name tag, that they generally work together well? Maybe I've missed it. Maybe that's not the biggest barrier that you think is to these things.
Getting to a goal in that context is always tough, and you never quite know for sure if a team or a community will get there. Again, more often, 99% of the time, they do get there. We support them. There's a intense, facilitation support that happens to enable that also in a way where nobody feels like this was shoved down their throat, but that they actually all feel quite committed to it. It is really, really hard work, for sure, and the hard facilitation work to get to that commitment to what appears to be an unreasonable 100-day goal. I think the toughest really part of the work is, in my view, is the fact that really we're asking leaders to step back and cede some control over what's going to happen, both in the 2-day of the launch as well as in the 100 days. I mean, that requires some coaching as well on our part to the leaders and some trust. I mean, partly a lot of people say, listen, you guys we've seen these results happen elsewhere. We want these results. If what it takes is for us to step back, we're happy to do that. But sometimes that's a big lift for people. And, it's normal. I mean, we all, we've all been in leadership positions, and, it's hard to cede decision making to others. And that's kind of what we're asking them to do. And then, the harder work is, staying with it to help these leaders begin to think about how to integrate a different way of leading into their day-to-day organizations, as opposed to this becoming kind of a special extracurricular thing that happens for 100 days. There's a lot of things that get in the way, don't get me wrong, but I think that's the hardest lift in my view.
You've kind of led me to where I wanted to go next, and you've alluded to it a couple of times in that. So what happens after 100 days? Is it normally that you find this audacious goal? You said 99% of the time, it gets achieved or something like that, but...
let me take that back. 99% of the time, but...
You're on tape saying it. No.
Surprisingly...
A large amount of time.
A larger percentage, or we haven't, done the percentages. Mm-hmm. But again, if to me, I'd rather a city say we're going to quadruple the pace at which we're taking, veterans off the street into housing, and then they triple it, rather than have a community say, we're going to increase it by 20% and they get to 30%. Yeah. So the fact that they tripled it, to me, the issue isn't did they achieve the goal? The issue is this a huge delta from where they were before? And did they achieve it in ways that can be sustained because they changed something about how their system operates, they changed something about how they work together, something flipped in the system that enables a sustainability.
And that's where I want to go. Do you find that is happening over, your past projects and the ones that you're currently working on now? It's forever the fear of, if I'm a leader and I'm hiring you to come in and it's like, hey, great, we're going to get something done over these 100 days. But then do we just sort of morph back into the old, or is this really system breaking, and are you really setting up new modes of doing work?
Yeah. So listen, this is really the obsession we have. I mean, I think we're able to help most, not just organizations, most systems achieve unthinkable results in 100 days. And often that's good enough for many people. For us, it's become like, I don't want to be, what's the term here? I don't want to be arrogant about it.
Okay.
It became a little bit easy, and we're trying to figure out, how can we increase the odds that these 100 days are truly transformative for the system. And that's a big lift. And we certainly have, we know for sure that having, repetition is helpful. So having 2 rounds, sometimes 3 rounds, which is what we did with NHS system in England, and some of the systems where we would have the first round of 100-day challenges, then another round of 100-day challenges on a related topic. And then we let the leaders of these 100, we train them and then let them lead their own 100-day challenges for a third round. So repetition helps for sure. But the other thing that we're really focused on is how we work more intentionally with the leaders during the 100 days. So they're in a position to build on what was achieved and to lock in the gains. So let me tell you, there's 2 aspects to the question of sustainability. There is, take an example, the city of Cleveland has, during the 100 days, began to use a more effective way to assemble a common list of young people who are experiencing homelessness, and a mechanism to work that list week in, week out with all the organizations together to prioritize, to match, to accompany these kids so they get into housing. They created tools that they use in child welfare that increase the odds that they can predict if somebody is graduating from foster care, that they may fall into homelessness. Therefore, let's surround them with preventive services. They did all of that in the 100 days. So one part of sustainability is, do they actually continue to use these mechanisms that have worked for them and enable these results beyond the 100 days? And that actually is, I think we're coming close to making that the norm rather than the exception in this work. So part of what we do, for example, is we have the teams at the 100-day mark come together again across different communities. And what they do is, in addition to celebrating success and learning at that workshop, is they create real plans that for what needs to happen to institutionalize the changes that they put in place to the system in which they operate. So some of the changes, maybe we need to hire somebody full-time to manage this weekly process that we're using for prioritization, for example, right? And then we accompany these teams back to their communities along with, so that they can assemble the system leaders that we met with way back before the launch, so that these recommendations can turn into commitments and follow-up action by these leaders. But obviously, if we had been working with the leaders all along, the chances of them jumping on that and owning it is going to be much higher. So that's the part that we're continuing to refine, is how do we create a journey not only for the 100-day teams, but the leaders that are surrounding these teams. Now, that's one aspect of sustainability, sustaining the actual technical innovations that emerged and enabling them to continue, and embedding them in the existing processes and systems of the community. I think the harder one is embedding the softer stuff that emerges in the 100 days and expanding on that. So the teams themselves develop relationships and trust that is quite remarkable in the 100 days. They're in the trenches together, so it's normal, especially if they succeed, that they're going to bond with each other. But that bond...
Sorry to interrupt, but do you find that those relationships last beyond the 100 days quite often?
Within the team members, absolutely. The question is, how do they expand that degree of trust and relationships into, across the system? And that becomes the work of the leaders as well. And sometimes that's why the repetition helps, because now you can involve other people into similar experiences that create these trusting relationships. So changing how people interact with each other, which is another form of sustainability, which is even more powerful because that's more adaptive. I mean, then if the situation changes, they can solve problems together in new ways, as opposed to sticking to the innovations that emerged in the first 100 days, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
And that's a harder one. We're working on it, but I wish I could say we've solved for that.
Well, that again, you seem to be really good at this. You're leading me into my next question so well. So if you look forward for rapid results in the next 2 or 3 years, you've described, working with the leaders more and then also sustaining those soft skills. Are there other aspects about how you would change your organization or how you are going to continue to evolve in order to not only include those, but maybe other goals for your organization? Like, what's the future look like?
So the answer is yes. We have some directions that we're pushing towards. And I've mentioned some of them, continuing this discovery process, which seems to be endless, frankly, because this is the sort of work where, I think the better you get at it, the more you realize how much you don't know about it, and therefore how much more discovery is ahead of you, particularly related to the questions or the things that we just talked about in terms of the increasing the odds of the sustaining both the hard innovations as well as the soft impact beyond the 100 days. The other thing we're really keen on is supporting this work at scale. We are a small organization, but we seem to be working, punching way above our weight in terms of supporting 100-day challenges in multiple cities on homelessness, in a couple of places in Africa. We're doing work with the Prime Minister's office in the UAE with, several. So we've got so much going on that it's kind of, you would think we've got 200 people running around doing this stuff, and we don't. We have less than a dozen people doing this work. So the next big thing for us is enabling scale, and we think part of that is by two things. One, a much more deliberate focus on training and enablement, both of people who we would like to expand our network so they can do similar work to what we do with some guidance and support from us, but also people in each of the communities in which we show up or organizations where we show up, so that they are kind of trained and enabled both as what we call coaches as well as sponsors, which are system leaders, as well as team leaders, so they can do more of this work with less and less support from us. And we're also looking at ways to create a bit more infrastructure to support this type of work that is more place-based. And this really was inspired by the experience we had in the UAE, where they physically created a space in, a large space in the Prime Minister's office, a little bit like the tech startup spaces like the Y Combinator. And essentially they said this is a space where teams from government and the private sector will come and sort of start their 100-day journeys by kind of being launched here. And, they will come, on a weekly basis, these teams, to get coached. And it created a very different environment where this became kind of part of the way the Prime Minister's office was accelerating implementation and innovation on, issues that were important and typically across several government departments. So, for example, one of the 100-day teams that was launched in the accelerator reduced by 16% NO2 emissions from the biggest aluminum smelter in the world. 16% in 100 days, that's equivalent to actually permanently taking 450,000 cars off the streets.
That's a small achievement. I mean, why would you even talk about that?
That's
amazing. That's amazing.
Mind-boggling. And this was just one example of several. So, and that's not just, so this is Ministry of Environment. This is the aluminum company. They had, in fact, General Electric ended up being pulled into the team to support the effort with a particular. So they just kind of assembled as part of this. And along the way, not just because they didn't know who it was that was needed until they got started. So, GE, which was not part of the initial team that was launched, was called in on the second day of the launch to participate and help figure out what they needed to do, to deal with that. So that became, part of, there's like a physical infrastructure, and it enables support at a different level. It enables, a much higher level of peer collaboration, just like, again, a Y Combinator, as part of the value proposition is that you're getting support from different entrepreneurs that are there, and the encouragement of both your peers as well as folks who may have had more experience than you. All of that made a big difference. So that's another thing we're looking at, is how do we replicate that type of a model in places, frankly, that need it more, in governments, perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, where we've worked before, and they've experienced a bit of this work, is helping them create something like this that embeds this work locally rather than have it be dependent on us parachuting in, if you will.
Nadim, I have two questions that I end every interview with. And the first one is, who do you pay attention to in order to refresh yourself, to get inspired, to stay up to the latest, maybe change the 100-day challenge? Are there magazines you read? I mean, and it could be, the usual obvious answer is obvious, you work with these teams, you listen to these people, but are there other external sources that...
I was going to go there, to be honest. But I do want to say that, again, just fresh from a launch last week, I mean, the amount of insight you get, even as a very experienced person, by being part of these and being able to step back and think about the changes you would have done to the lead up to the launch, for example, it seems to never fail. It's like the continuous learning by, being there and both listening and observing and trying to do stuff. And frankly, I mean, the most amazing, let me give you an example. So I was working with the sponsors for part of the launch. The sponsors would be the elected 2 or 3 leaders that were elected by the system leaders to represent them as the mechanisms for supporting, the focal points for supporting the team. So they have somebody to go to, so to speak. So I was trying to give them the one-on-one on coaching, because that's the role we want them to play with their team leaders, is to become mentors and coaches for these. And so, before going into this, I had, created, some definitions that, coming out of the different, the association for American coaches, this and that. And I wrote these down. But then I actually started by asking them about their experience of being coached and derived with them some principles and, for coaching. And when I looked at what they came up with, and then I showed them what the definitions and all the stuff that was written about this, both them and I were like, I mean, the stuff that just emerged from you guys is so much more powerful than...
It's so much better than...
and everything that's been written about this.
These academic definitions are horrible. Yeah.
So it's just like, to me, the amount of the wealth of knowledge and experience that goes untapped in people is the revelation that it keeps sort of hitting me in the face. And just that was an example from, Friday, really.
It's so fantastic, though. And I'm not going to apologize about it either, that I love, having people like yourself on the show and these interviews where it becomes so clear that the collaboration space, the working together as true teams, especially when you're bringing in people, as you do, from many different groups who usually don't work together, and suddenly they agree to have that trust bond. It's amazing what happens. And you never cease to be amazed by it.
Exactly. So outside of that, I actually do read a lot, and things ranging from, the blog that I think the author of that blog now is he wrote a book about it, Barking Up the Wrong Tree. You know which one I'm talking about?
I do not, but I will Google Barking Up the Wrong Tree immediately.
Yes, something like that. I'm not sure I got it right, but there are a number I do read a lot. I check my Twitter feed every so often, and what I find myself maybe twice a week is picking something up from my Twitter feed and passing on to my team. Yeah, there's a whole movement. I tell you, a book that I read that gave me a lot of language for what we have seen and experienced in the 100-day teams. It's called Reinventing the Corporation by Frederick Laloux, and I recommend it to a lot of people. I'm a big fan of Dan Heath, the Heath brothers, Dan and Chip Heath. They wrote the book Switch and a bunch of other books. So yeah, I find that there's a lot of people that are operating and thinking in the same space that we are. And, we've got a lot to learn from them. I think the piece that we bring that's somewhat unique is this focus on actual results, in addition to all the other wonderful, change management tools, and kind of the idea of what happens when you create the right conditions and give people 100 days to achieve something that they thought was impossible.
The last question I have for you allows you to step outside your box a little bit, and is there an innovation out there? Is there something in the horizon that either you're excited to use in your work, or perhaps it doesn't have anything to do with your work, that maybe it's not getting a shout out, it needs a shout out, or it's not getting the press that it needs, or it's a technology or a process or something that you're super excited about that you'd like to let everybody know about?
That's interesting. Well, I can mention, a couple of people that I am a big fan of. I don't know if they need my help to be shouted, from the rooftop, but Feedback Labs and my good friend and hopefully soon board member perhaps, Dennis Whittle, would be one organization and one thought leader that I think has a lot of promise in the development work.
Just so you know, Dennis was just recently on the show, and so that's
great.
That's a great endorsement. I'm glad. I enjoyed that conversation a lot. I think that the Feedback Lab is doing powerful work.
He's amazing. And another person that I really have a lot of respect for in terms of where he's taken his work is a smaller organization, I think. It's called Accountability Lab as well. It's got a lab in there. Have you come across them?
We've actually had them on the show as well. Blair Gencourse.
Yes.
Yeah, Blair's one. He was actually one of the first guests on the show way back, maybe almost 2 years ago. I should probably have him back on the show, to be honest with you. But again,
quite a bit in the last 2 years.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. He's really evolved over the last couple of years. So I think it's about time to have him back on the show.
So these come to mind. Again, I think they probably don't need a shout out from me, but I have a lot of respect for them.
Nadim, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, we finally got to put this together, but I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about Rapid Results, and I wish you all luck.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.